The senator from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to address an opportunity that we have in this body to fix a flaw in a provision in this infrastructure bill. I want to thank my colleague from Oregon and our colleague from Wyoming. The three of us have been working on this, and I really hope we get this done. I'm going to insist on having a vote on this. And let me just give a little context here. So we're all aware of this new category of assets some would describe as currencies, which are also called cryptocurrencies. And this is a fascinating development. Actually, some have been around for some time now, but they've come into the public eye in a much, much bigger way in recent years, very recent years. And while sometimes we think of this as some kind of unit of value that is traded and has some pretty spectacular volatility sometimes, for me, while that's very interesting, what's much more interesting is the underlying technology and what that might make possible. I'm still trying to understand. I'm still on a steep learning curve about all the possibilities of the distributed ledger technology, the methodology by which cryptocurrencies can be exchanged without an intermediary. There's no bank that the money has to go through. It is an amazing and fascinating technology where individuals scattered around the globe actually validate the legitimacy of a transaction, and it becomes immutable. And there's a permanent record in some cases. There are other models where it's different. But this is an amazing technology that has tremendous potential. We had a hearing in the Banking Committee just last week at my request. The chairman agreed to a hearing where we talked about some of the use cases for this underlying technology, and we heard some amazing things. So the most common activity now is trading in these digital currencies, whether it's Bitcoins or Ethereum or others. There's many, many of them. And that's the biggest single activity, but there are very, very important and interesting additional use cases that are occurring. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is the potential to have this dispersed mechanism for validating ownership. Think of all the amount of time and money and effort we spend on all kinds of transactions where ultimately we're trying to validate someone's ownership, the title to their house, the title to their car, your ownership of the stocks that you bought from your broker. All of this is, we've developed very expensive, actually, and sometimes time-consuming processes by which we do this. This can all be done on the blockchain. This can all be done almost instantly, at almost no cost. And I think that this is the direction that we're going to be heading in. That's just one example. There's another whole category that's fascinating to me, which is what people refer to as programmable money. Think about it. Programmable money, what is that? Well, here's a great example that we heard at our hearing from a witness who works for a company that actually provides these kinds of services. But here's an example. You know, one of the things that's always been a challenge is how do you ensure that, say, a person who has a copyright is properly compensated when that copyright is used in one form or another. You know, I used to have a restaurant, and when we played music in the background to create a certain ambiance in our restaurant, how do you make sure that the people who have the copyright on those songs gets paid properly for that? I'll tell you, it's a terrible system. It's completely arbitrary, and there's no precision to it. There's no way to monitor. Well, how about an idea where you have a programmable capability where if I listen to a music app on my iPhone, for every second of a particular artist's music I listen to, it automatically sends a corresponding tiny fraction of some currency to the person who owns that copyright. That is completely doable in the context of this kind of technology. Mr. President, I just mentioned these two things just to provide a little tiny glimpse and illustration of the kinds of amazing things that I think this underlying technology is capable of and is likely going to change the way we do an awful lot of things in the coming years. So I say that as background because in this legislation, there is a very reasonable intent, but I think the drafting doesn't get it quite right. The intent is to say, for those exchanges, for those places where people go to buy and sell cryptocurrencies, and there are centralized exchanges where that happens every day on a huge volumes. We want to require these exchanges to have the same kind of reporting requirements that a conventional broker would have when a security is bought. So in other words, we want the folks who run the exchange to report the name, some identifying number, maybe it's a social security number, the dollar amount, and all of this is because people buying and selling these cryptocurrencies are generating capital gains and losses. It's an asset. If you sell it later after a gain, you should have to pay a capital gains tax on that asset, if you, depending on how long you've held it. If you've lost money on it, then you ought to be able to take that loss against gains that you may have elsewhere. So it is completely reasonable to have a provision that requires the reporting of the transaction. That, I think, is the intent of this legislation. But unfortunately, the way it got drafted, to my reading, and I'm certainly not alone, I think this is almost universally acknowledged, the language would impose this reporting requirement on people involved in the cryptocurrency world who don't even have the information about the person making the purchase or the sale. So, for instance, it might very well be interpreted to impose this reporting requirement on the miners, the people who are involved in the arithmetic process by which you validate transactions. They don't even know the names. They get a numerical representation of the transaction. They don't know who's behind it. They have no idea. They have no way of knowing. So it's not a reasonable, not an even slightly reasonable burden to impose on them. That's one little example of how badly flawed this language is. It wasn't intended that way. The good news is it can be fixed. And Senator Wyden and Senator Lummis and I have come up with language that fixes this problem. It would make sure that the reporting requirement on a centralized exchange, the folks running that who have this information would in fact have to report it. They don't right now. There's no statute, there's no regulation that requires that. This would require the reporting. And the industry is fine with that. They recognize that they should have to report this. But they also recognize that it should only be imposed on people for whom it makes sense, right? To people who actually have that information. So our amendment addresses this. It fixes this. It solves this problem. I think it achieves the intent. And we're having a little trouble getting the ability to offer this as an amendment here on the Senate floor on this bill. I am not here to ask that we simply adopt it by acclamation. I welcome debate and welcome a vote, but we ought to be able to have a vote. We absolutely should have this debate and have a vote before we go ahead and impose this requirement. And if we were not to adopt this amendment, then we could be doing a lot of damage. We could have a very chilling effect on the development of this technology, and that's what I am most concerned about. That's what I want to avoid. This technology is very, very exciting, has tremendous potential, and the last thing we should do is allow a flawed drafting exercise to have this chilling effect on the further development of this technology. I see the senator from Oregon is here on the floor, and I want to thank him for his leadership in this effort, for his work. He and I think, have a very similar way of viewing this, and if he'd like to make some comments, I will yield some time to him.
I thank my colleague, and I will be brief. As Senator Toomey has indicated, he and Senator Lummis and I have an amendment to the infrastructure bill dealing with cryptocurrencies and taxes. And I'm going to go into some of the philosophical underpinnings of what we are doing, but I want to note something at the outset.
Will be in order.
Our amendment, this bipartisan amendment, ought to be accepted when the author of the underlying provision has said publicly he will vote for it if the Senate gets a chance to vote, as Senator Toomey and I have indicated. So let me just outline a couple of fundamental propositions about our proposal and start with one that ought to bring the United States Senate together. People avoiding taxes they owe on money through cryptocurrencies is a serious issue. It's fundamentally unfair to every working person whose taxes come straight out of their paycheck. Now, my view is the Senate needs to make sure that new rules addressing this tax avoidance ensure that it's possible to run down the crooks, have strong tax enforcement, while leaving a clear field for an innovation here at home. We want that innovation here. The fact is, when you don't innovate someplace, it goes somewhere else. We want it here at home. Without our amendment, this bipartisan amendment, it seems to us that essentially the whole notion of dealing with tax avoidance somehow is going to get lost in approaches for the brick and mortar rule. And as I said, those rules run the very real risk of chilling innovation in the digital economy and driving the core innovations in crypto to places far beyond the reach of the U.S. Treasury and other law enforcement. So, 2 sentences about what we do in our amendment. We want it stated that tax enforcement rules should focus on the companies that deal with buying, selling, and trading cryptocurrencies. These rules don't need to sweep up other uses of blockchain technologies that have nothing to do with tax avoidance. Senator Toomey and I serve on the Senate Finance Committee. I'm the chair. Senator Toomey, a senior member. We've been struck by how many people in that space, the various aspects of blockchain technologies, don't even have the documents, the tax documents, that they would have to file normally if they were one of these big crypto exchanges. Now, the fact is, making changes in both tech and tax policy is hard work that takes time. When I wrote the Internet Tax Non-Discrimination Act that ensured that the rules online and the rules offline would be the same, we had hearings, we had debates, we focused on the issues and produced bipartisan legislation. The Senate is going to debate these issues further in the months and years ahead. As the chairman of this committee, I am open to working with anybody who wants to show that tough, effective tax enforcement and promoting innovation, that's not mutually exclusive. Smart policy, smart targeted policy will get you both. Our amendment simply says that nobody can use crypto to avoid paying the taxes they owe, and anybody acting as a broker in the cryptocurrency industry must comply with reporting requirements the same as brokers in every other industry. That's because they're brokers. They're not the people that Senator Toomey and I have been concerned about would kind of be swept up in this treatment of crypto exchanges and the like. So we advocate a smart targeted approach. And we make sure that reporting requirements, just like brokers in every other industry, are complied with. That's the kind of policy in the crypto area, Mr. President, that lays the foundation for future debates. What Senator Toomey and I are doing is very focused in one specific area, making sure we come down hard on tax avoidance by brokers and people in crypto exchanges, but we also make sure we're not discouraging innovation in other areas. So this is going to be a debate that's going to play out over the years. But when the author of the provision in the bipartisan proposal on crypto, the author of the underlying provision in the legislation in front of us today, has publicly said in the last few hours he will vote for what Senator Toomey, Senator Loomis, and I have developed. We certainly ought to get a vote, and my own view is it ought to be accepted by this body. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Reclaiming my time, I want to thank my colleague from Oregon for his thoughtful leadership on this. I think the senator from Wyoming, Senator Lummis, is on her way down, and she's going to join us, as she has been an integral part of this effort to just correct this. This is a big deal in a number of respects, Mr. President. I would point out, I want to stress, right now, there is no statutory reporting requirement in this whole space. There's no regulatory requirement. I don't think you could have a regulatory requirement without a statute authorizing it. So this is a big deal. It would require the companies operating these exchanges to report this financial information so that it dramatically enhances the likelihood that capital gains taxes would be collected. So this provision scores as a source of revenue because it increases the likelihood of compliance. I don't know why anyone would object. In fact, I'm not aware of any objection of the substance of this on my side of the aisle. I know Senator Wyden has like-minded folks on his side of the aisle. But it's really important that we not overreach, that we not do this wrong. Now, we have not gone through the ordinary process for developing tax legislation. Tax legislation is notoriously complicated and difficult to get exactly right and prone to unintended consequences. And so normally we'd have hearings in the Finance Committee, we'd get input from all kinds of experts, we'd make drafts, we'd circulate the drafts. I mean, it's a long process to make sure you get it right. This has gone through none of that, zero. And so what we're trying to do is say, let's restrict this to where it belongs. Let's clean this up the best we can. And you know what? This space is changing. And a year from now, there'll be new innovations that we haven't thought of, that probably nobody's thought of. And we'll probably have to go back and revisit this. But what we wouldn't want to do, what we shouldn't want to do, is have an overly broad mandate, a reporting requirement on people who can't possibly comply with it because they don't have the information. We wouldn't want to impose that and have a stifling impact on the development of a really, really exciting and potentially powerful new technology. That's what this is about. And as I said earlier, I'm going to insist on having a vote on this. I don't know why we wouldn't win on by a big margin, since, after all, we're just ensuring that we get the intent of this legislation rather than a miscarriage of it. As a senator from Oregon pointed out, Senator Portman from Ohio, who has worked so long and so hard on this infrastructure bill, he supports us getting a vote on this. He supports the amendment that we have drafted. So I am hopeful that that this is going to pass, but I'm going to be insistent that we get our vote. And that's something that we ought to do.